Hello again, everybody. This is Derek, and I am back at you with another Wargaming in miniature video. And in this video, we're going to continue on with our O Group boot camp. All right, now in the previous video, we talked about the battalion, and then we talked about the troop ratings. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, which is deploying the battalion, and how you go about, setting up your game. And then we'll talk about combat patrols. Deploying the battalion. Okay, first of all, the first step is game setup. Okay, so you and your opponent get together, you establish your battalion forces. You determine what the battalion rating is going to be. You define the terrain. Like you say, this is a built-up area. This is woods. These are hedges, and this is a road, and etc. So it's pretty obvious, but maybe you've got something out there that represents a crop field, but it's also supposed to be rough terrain or something like that. And that's usually determined by in the scenario. And then you're going to set up your plans and establish objectives. And this is kind of a personal thing you do with yourself. Like you set up a plan of attack or defense, and then you determine what the objectives are going to be. A lot of times this scenario will tell you what the objectives are, but you can set up minor objectives in your head, like I want to go ahead and take this built-up area before I take this woods. Or you could say, I want to make sure I clear out this little clearing here before I move on to take this field. And this is all done kind of secondhand, internally, without even any thought, really. A lot of people, experienced gamers, will know exactly what I'm talking about. But if you're a new gamer, just put some thought behind it, like what you're going to do during the game. Then we go through the defenders and attackers deployment before we begin turn 1. Really what we're talking about here in this video is how to go about the deployment. But I'm still going to break down those 5 bullet points before we continue. So 4.2, battalion forces and the battalion HQ rating. Players establish the ability and morale of their headquarters and note the composition and troop ratings of their battalion units and any support assets that they may have. Attacking headquarters start with 3 headquarters orders, and defending headquarters start with 2 headquarters orders. And I keep track of that using a die. So like if that was my battalion headquarters, I would put it close to my table edge, and I would put a die on it to represent my headquarters orders. And then remember, the attacker starts with 3, and the defender starts with 2. In my little battlefield here, I went ahead and just set up something easy and quick just to kind of show off a variety of different things. And the attacker is going to be on the near edge, and the defender is going to be on the far edge. And it's just to show how the deployment works. Terrain. All terrain features should be clearly identified, and the exact boundary if they block or permit line of sight, etc. Okay, plans and objectives. The battalion commander must allocate each company to its own objectives and area of table in which to operate. The battalion commander may also designate 1 or more companies as their battalion reserves. Okay, company sectors. Each company deployed on the table must have its own deployment area. This can be as simple as saying a company on the left flank holding the village of Tilly, B Company on the right flank holding the farm of LaHaye and its environs, and C Company in reserve. Okay, take special note. Companies should not overlap or intermix unless using consolidation, and there should be a clear boundary between them, although players can alter the boundaries if the battle situation requires. This is something that in most games it's a given, and in this, I think the writer of the rules wrote this in as for beginners, right? Just letting them know that this is how it's done historically. This is what you should do before the game starts. It's kind of like hand-holding almost, if you want to call it that. But he put it in there to basically just make it clear that this is what's supposed to be done. And then the reserve companies may be given either a single terrain feature or deployment position to deploy onto when committed, or simply committed at the time and place of the battalion's choosing. So if I was to say, like, A Company is on the left side of this road, and B Company will be on the right side of the road, and then C Company is going to come in and consolidate, but only once I've been able to clear this field. So when I'm able to clear this field, Charlie Company, the reserve company, will deploy there. Objectives. The game should have an objective such as capturing and holding physical features or simply defending the opposing battalion. Players use one of the following: a tactical position or attacking phase line, or tactical superiority, or a combination of both. Okay, so let's talk about a tactical position or attacking phase line. Players can set each company an objective to capture. Like I might say, A Company, I want you to make sure you capture that town there. And B Company, make sure you capture this field. A phase line is determined by the attacking player and used to control and coordinate the advance. So this is an alternative to objectives. So I could say the first phase line would be through this village and this field. That would be my first phase line. And my second phase line might be this village and this tip of the woods. That might be my second phase line. Phase line 1 could be a key village, and phase line 2 like a bridge or something like that. As your forces advance to each phase line, they may halt or consolidate and await reinforcements before advancing to the next objective, or may be ordered to go firm on ground they have won, permitting other units to take over the advance. Attacking players simply note down each phase line objective for their companies on their battle plan. Okay, so this is the first time they talk about writing something down with a pen and paper onto your battle plan. So in that plan, you're going to designate your company's sectors of where they're at. You're going to designate the reserve company's consolidation objective. You're also going to note either your company's objectives or phase lines. This will all be written down, and it can be written down really quickly. What you could do is sketch out a map. Could be very crude, and then just draw on the map the phase lines or circle the objectives. Just put a big A on this side and a big B on this side, and then put a dotted line down the road or something like that. However you want to do it, whatever you think is the best way. Okay, the second way you could do it is tactical superiority. Set the game victory conditions based on defeating the opposing battalion via casualties, or a combination of both. Deployment, or getting ready, you set all that up. After the terrain is set up, everybody identifies what the terrains are. You show off your battalions. Everybody knows what your battalions are and what they consist of. You secretly write down your battle plan, and all of that shouldn't take but maybe 2 or 3 minutes, right? And then we go to the initial battalion deployment. Step 1, you deploy your headquarters. Step 2, deploy company commanders. Then step 3, we're going to roll our deployment dice. And then step 4 is you just go on to the game's turn 1. Okay, so the first thing you do is deploy headquarters. Both players deploy their battalion headquarters anywhere along their rear table edge or off table. Attacking headquarters start with 3 headquarters orders, and defending headquarters start with 2. We already talked about that. Battalion mortars are considered off table, but you can, if you wish, put mortar models next to your battalion headquarters as a reminder of their availability. And that's it. Basically, you just set up your headquarters, you put your mortars down. You can either put it at the edge of the table or you can leave it off table, because technically your headquarters and your mortars would be some distance to the rear. Okay, the next one is deploy company commanders. Both players deploy their on-table company commanders. Defending commanders deploy first behind the forward defense line within their assigned sectors. So if I had 2 German company commanders, I might set up one behind this woods there, and I might set up my second one in this field over there, right? And those would be my German company commanders on table. My third company might be in reserve. And then the Allies set up their company commanders, and you would set these up based on the distance. Now, a lot of times the scenario will tell you where the start line is. The defender usually has a larger start line, usually like 24 inches, which could be half of the table. And then the attacking start line is usually only like 6 inches to 1 foot. You have a smaller deployment zone usually on the attacking side than you do on the defender. That's based on your scenario or later on when we talk about the deployment, the start line. Basically, the defensive start line is usually 24 inches and the attacking start line is 12 inches. But we'll talk about that when we get to the deployment. And then, of course, my third company is off table in reserve. And then we go into battalion deployment dice. Now, this is the most important and most exciting part of the whole deployment. And this really makes or breaks the way your battalion starts on the table. So both players roll their battalion deployment dice, which is 9 dice. If the attacker is a large battalion, remember we talked about battalion size in the previous video. If it's a large battalion, then they would roll 10 dice. But because no one's large, these are just standard, we're going to roll 9 dice each. Players note the deployment dice scores against the deployment table, which I'll put up on the screen here so that you can see the scores. And then whatever is not placed on the table is left in your tray off table in reserve, and then you can bring them on as everything goes. And then we'll start with turn 1. But let's talk about our deployment dice. When you roll your dice, you're going to score a number. Remember, everything is a d6. You're going to score a number between 1 and 6, right? Obviously. 1s are special, and 5 to 6 is special. 2 to 4 is kind of the standard. But let's go ahead and roll. Let's roll the deployment dice. Now, I grabbed 9 dice here for the Americans. We're going to roll them. I'll put them right here. And then I've got 9 dice for the Germans defending, and we'll roll those right here. So now we have to group them into 1s and 5s and 6s and 2 to 4, right? Okay, that might not be good. I think I turned that one, but we'll play with it. 1s, 5s and 6s, and 2 to 4. Okay, so if you're the defender, you look under the defender's deployment results, which is the top of the 2, and it says 1s, a maximum of 3. So luckily, I only rolled 2. So they get no deployment, opening barrage, interdiction. Okay, we'll talk about that in just a second. And then 2 to 4, deploy 1 combat patrol behind the forward defense line. And we already talked, that's 24 inches for the defender. So this tells me I get 4 of my combat patrol. In this example, I'm going to take 2 combat patrols from each company. And in this case, I'm going to put 1. It has to be behind the forward start line, or, the defensive start line, which is 24 inches. And I'm going to put 1 there, and I'm going to put 1 there. And then the Germans are going to start 1 there and maybe 1 there, because my 24-inch line is right here. Okay, and that's these 4 right there. And so I could just pick these up saying, okay, they've already been deployed. Now those 5s and 6s. Deploy 1 ambush unit behind the forward defense line. Okay, so I can deploy 3 ambush units. Now, again, you take out your battle plan and you mark down on your plan where those 3 units are located. And I've decided that I want to put a 88 there. I wanted to put an anti-tank gun on the edge of the woods right there. And then I have this small infantry gun that I'm gonna ambush from this edge. So I'm putting a lot in this area. So those would be my 3 ambushes. Now, remember, I'm not actually putting these figures on the table. I'm marking that down on my battle plan so that but I know that they're there. They're not actually on the table. Now let's talk about those 1s. Opening barrage, interdiction. The vast majority of World War II attacks were usually accompanied by an opening barrage. This effect of an opening barrage in O group is represented by scores of 1. Now, they're different when it's a defender score of 1 or an attacker score of 1. So the defender score of 1, each score of 1 rolled on the defenders equates to a number of game turns that his reserve deployments are interdicted or disrupted. For example, if you rolled just 1, then it would last for 1 turn. If you rolled 2, then it would be 2 turns. And so what we'll do is I'll use a die to represent how many turns my reserves are interdicted. And basically what the interdiction effect is when an infantry, reconnaissance, or gun, remember off table in my tray, tries to deploy onto a combat patrol, my opponent, which would be the Germans, rolls a d6. On a score of 1 to 3, the unit deploys as normal, and a 4 to 6, the unit fails to deploy. So basically I got a 50% chance for bringing things onto the table for 2 turns in this case. And that would be all of their deployment dice. All right, so let's talk about the attacker's deployment dice, which is just a little bit different. Now, 1s up to a maximum of 3, which I do have 3, is no deployment. Basically, I don't get to put any troops on the table, but I do have opening barrage casualties on the defender. Okay, so attacker score of 1. If I rolled 1-1, then I would remove an entire defender platoon. Actually, my German opponent would remove an entire infantry platoon, not a stand. If I rolled 2 1s, the defender removes a platoon and a headquarters order. So instead of having 2, he would be down to 1. And then because I rolled 3 1s, the defender removes 1 infantry platoon and 1 section of any type and 1 headquarters order. Now, if I roll more than 3 1s, re-roll any excess. So I basically do a re-roll. And the defender may choose the platoon or sections to remove from this force. Units lost in the opening barrage do not count toward FUBAR and defeat purposes. Okay, FUBAR is a way to keep track of how bad, we haven't gotten into morale yet, but it treats like how bad your side has suffered casualties. And when you reach a certain number of FUBAR, then you actually lose the game. So this would not count against that. They would just be basically removed from the game. Now, there are exceptions. If a defending Russian battalion loses an infantry platoon, it is immediately replaced with a green rifle platoon. So you don't actually lose it, it just kind of degrades it down to green. This does not happen if the platoon lost to the bombardment was already green. Now, if the defender is fielding a worn battalion, remember worn battalion is usually just 2 companies and not 3, players ignore the opening barrage casualties as a worn battalion is assumed to already have been badly hit by the barrage. Okay. And then, now remember, each score of 2, 3, or 4, which is these two. Okay, that's this. That removed the platoon, battalion headquarters, order, and a section. So I'm already feeling good about it. And then the 2 to 4 is combat patrols. And in this case, I'll deploy 1 combat patrol from each company. And remember, I can only set it up to 12 inches. I'm going to go ahead and take that town first, so we'll set it up right there. And that would be these 2 combat patrols. You see, I don't really have a whole lot deployed on the table, do I? And then finally, the 5 and 6, I can deploy 1 on-table unit behind the start line. Okay, each score of 5 or 6 for the attacker permits 1 unit to deploy directly on the tabletop behind the start line. An on-table unit can be an infantry platoon plus its attachment. It can be a heavy weapon section or platoon. It can be an AFV platoon or section, and 1 gun platoon or section. Or if I wanted, I could add yet another combat patrol. That means I can put 4 units on the table. Now, in this example, I'm going to place an anti-tank gun as one of my sections. I'm going to put an infantry platoon as my second deployment. And then my 3rd and 4th are going to be armored sections. So I'll put an armored vehicle there, and I'll put an armored vehicle there. Now, because they're more than 6 inches apart, they're not a platoon, they're individual sections. If I was to deploy this armor like within 6 inches, I could have deployed it as a platoon, and then I could get another section, another platoon deployed somewhere, but I didn't want to do that. I want to put them there. Just to kind of summarize real quick, and then we'll talk about exchanging dice. The attacker ones cause casualties on the opponent, the defender, where the defender's ones slow the deployment of troops down a number of turns. The defender's 5s and 6s give them ambush units, where the attacker's 5s and 6s allow them to deploy units. So you have units on the table, ambush and hidden. Everything in the middle, the 2 to 4, is combat patrols. If a player gains no on-table units, he may exchange 2 combat patrols for 1 on-table unit. Okay, let's talk about combat patrols real quick before we get into that. Because remember, each score of 2, 3, or 4 permits a player to deploy 1 combat patrol from his total number of combat patrols anywhere behind the start line. If the attacker, or anywhere behind the forward defense line if the defender. Okay, those are pretty obvious. Now, there are some restrictions. Each company commander may deploy a maximum of 3 combat patrols in his sector, and then you cannot deploy more combat patrols than the on-table company commanders have available. Hypothetically, let's say I had 2 companies on the table, but I rolled 7 combat patrols. Well, you can only deploy 6 because that's the most you can deploy. Now, ambush units. Ambush units are not placed on the table. The models are left off table, ready to deploy when the ambush is sprung. The player decides upon a terrain piece that they occupy, which must be some form of cover, such as woods or building or hedge or whatever. Or you can say like medium machine gun in the church tower. The defender may swap ambush units for combat patrols if he wishes, and if he gains no ambush units, he may exchange 2 combat patrols for an ambush unit. Now, additional ambush units. In addition to the dice rolls, the defender may also place any heavy guns in ambush and man any bunkers or dugouts with an ambush unit. Okay, and finally, forward observers. The FO may be placed anywhere behind the attacker's start line or defender's start line and are classed as in ambush. This ambush deployment is in addition to the deployment dice rolls. Even though he's considered in ambush, I would still put him on the table just to, let me know that he's there. But technically, he's in ambush. I might mark him with a token letting everyone know that he's still considered in ambush, which basically means he's completely hidden. Okay, let's talk about the reserves, because you've got a company in reserves. All remaining platoons and sections not initially deployed are held off table in reserve. You may bring on reserves in the following turns. Company reserves. Okay, so basically, like, this company has one of its platoons deployed, but it still has 2 more platoons. Infantry company reserves and any attached support units must enter the table in their company sector. Support assets deployed with flexible reserve battalions can be deployed and attached to a company of the player's choice at the time of deployment. Rigid reserves doctrine battalions must allocate their reserves to their respective infantry companies before the game begins. That's company reserves. Now, battalion reserves. The battalion commander may hold an entire infantry company back as the battalion reserve. The battalion reserve can be deployed on either a planned objective, like I chose this field, or deployment position, or any on-table sector of the player's choice at a time of his choosing, regardless of the battalion's reserve doctrine. It can be deployed in 3 methods. Table edge. All units may be deployed onto their rear-friendly table edge using a deploy or reserve action. So I can bring people on from the edge. Combat patrols. Some reserve units may deploy on table from combat patrols. Take special note, AFVs, other than reconnaissance, and heavy guns may not deploy onto combat patrols. Well, for one thing, these AFVs are not part of the company. They are a support element, right? But if I had a combat patrol here, I can't swap that out for a tank. And we'll talk about combat patrols and deployment in a bit. And then consolidation action. Units may be deployed on captured objectives or held position using this action. So once this field is taken, I can use the consolidation action to bring in Charlie Company and put him on that field. Now, if this scenario was not an attacker-defender situation, if it was a meeting engagement, in a meeting engagement, both players are classed as attackers. The player with the most reconnaissance units may choose to deploy either first or second. If no reconnaissance units are deployed, or both have an equal number, then roll a die, and the winner can be the first or second. Ignore opening barrage casualties and interdictions. If you roll 1, it's basically just a wasted roll. All right, so that is how you get your troops on the table, right? And then working from this initial deployment, your troops will gradually be thrown into the battle. You can add more combat patrols. You can deploy units onto combat patrols. So basically, I can add a unit to a combat patrol, and then I can also summon another combat patrol. Right. Okay, let's talk about combat patrols, because that's chapter 5, and that's the second half of this video. So, combat patrol overview. Combat patrols cover the actions of small fighting patrols of infantry or scouts making their way forward to take up advanced positions on the battlefield. Their role is to deploy reserve infantry, reconnaissance AFVs, and light guns on the table, deny ground to opposing combat patrols, and represent unknown activity and the fog of war. This combat patrol doesn't necessarily represent men moving forward. It could just represent the enemy thinking there's men moving forward. It could represent a confusion. It could represent actual men moving forward. Okay, how many combat patrols? Each company may deploy a maximum of 3 combat patrols in their sector at any time. Reserve companies cannot deploy combat patrols until their commander is deployed. This is the maximum a battalion has during the game. Combat patrols not initially on the table are placed in reserved and may be deployed in later turns. Your combat patrols can be a convenient marker and can be a reasonable size you wish. I've seen a lot of people use poker chips. A 2-inch square or circle works well for 15mm figures. That's what these are. These are 2-inch circles. These could be modeled with figures or simply be a different color. Okay, using combat patrols. Combat patrols are responsible for both scouting and probing and deploying units from reserve. So they do quite a bit of things. Okay, I'm going to read this little section backwards. Scouting and probing. Combat patrols can scout potential ambush positions. A player may also use combat patrols simply to confuse the enemy, using them to probe and threaten an enemy sector without deploying onto them. Just hypothetically, this is actually only like 2 feet wide. So imagine a 6-foot wide table split down the middle. So you could have like 3 feet. But let's say I had a combat patrol over here. I had a combat patrol here, and I had a combat patrol there, right? As the defending Germans, all you see are these 3 tokens moving forward. You don't really know where the troops are located. And let's say, hypothetically, the Germans decide that they want to aggressively attack this area. As an attacker, I can opt to deploy onto these combat patrols, or I could decide to ignore that and deploy onto this combat patrol, because that was never my objective. This field was. So you can use them kind of as like dummy tokens, if you wish. Let's talk about deploying reserve units. This represents your commanders bringing troops onto the battle using hidden movement and infiltration. A player may deploy a reserve unit from the list below using a combat patrol currently on the table within their company sector. by using a deploy action. This may be one infantry platoon plus attachments, one heavy weapon platoon or section, one reconnaissance AFE, like an armored car, a half-track, a carrier, or wheeled vehicle, one light gun section, or a FO company commanders. And FOs may also deploy with any of the above units for free. Or you can have your FO on the table, right, already. Okay, a maximum of one unit may deploy from a combat patrol. As soon as the unit deploys onto a combat patrol, the combat patrol marker is placed back into reserves. A reserve unit may still deploy on a combat patrol even if the marker moved this phase. So let's say these guys were back here at the start, and I gave this guy an order to move, and he moved up to there, and then I can give an order to deploy, and then I can put a platoon onto this combat patrol. And when I do that, then I just remove this combat patrol and put it back into my reserve tray. Basically, you can cycle through them. Deploying on a combat patrol uses up the deploying unit's entire move, but it may still fire. So basically when I put even if this guy did not move, if I deploy onto him with my infantry platoon, they're considered moving, so they get a reduced firepower. A single transport section carrying passengers or towing light guns may also deploy in a combat patrol if the transport is a jeep, light truck, carrier, motorcycle. Larger transports and tows cannot deploy onto a combat patrol. Now, there are restrictions. No deployment is permitted if the combat patrol is within 8 inches of the enemy. And you can't deploy on a combat patrol if the combat patrol deployed this turn. So, if I use an action to deploy a combat patrol and I put the combat patrol out, I can't now also place an order to deploy on that combat patrol. You can't. It's like a double quick. You can't do that. The combat patrol has to have been there, and then on the next turn you can deploy on it. Each company can only deploy its own reserve units onto combat patrols. Tanks, including fully tracked recon tanks, heavy guns, and motorized infantry may only deploy on the table edge. These units cannot deploy on a combat patrol. Okay. So far, so good. Deploying combat patrols. After the initial deployment, other combat patrols can be deployed using the deploy action. They must be deployed within 18 inches of a steady company commander and within his assigned table sector. So I could not take one of his combat patrols and deploy it over there because that's not his sector, right? This road breaks up your sector. So I would have to deploy it in here. And I could deploy it 18 inches out, right? I could deploy it all the way out there. Combat patrols cannot be deployed within 8 inches of an enemy unit. Okay, so let's back up. 8 inches is for 15 millimeter. 10 inches if you're using a larger scale, like 20 millimeter or bigger. Combat patrols cannot be deployed if a straight line drawn from the commander to the intended deployment position passes through an enemy. Let's say, hypothetically, this infantry gun had moved all the way up to there, somehow. Let's just say. And he wanted to deploy a combat patrol. I could not deploy it here. Well, first of all, I can't deploy it within 8 inches of the enemy. But let's say this was more than 8 inches away from any enemy. I could not deploy it there because it travels, there's a straight line. Now I could deploy it there because there is a free line. Basically, enemy units can block. And if you have like a platoon of guys, then, you know, when you have an 18-inch potential deployment range, that becomes fairly important. Okay, reconnaissance and combat patrols. A reconnaissance section using a reconnaissance action may deploy a combat patrol on or within 3 inches of its current location. Let's say I had a reconnaissance jeep out there, and he wanted, now he's not a company commander, he's a reconnaissance element. He can deploy a combat patrol, but it has to be within 3 inches of him. That reconnaissance unit is then permanently removed from play. So you go, boop, permanently. The standard limitations on deploying combat patrols apply, but do not need to be within 18 inches of a company commander. Reconnaissance units removed in this way are not classed as losses for FUBAR purposes. So it's basically a free loss. So let's say you're playing a very large table, or maybe lengthwise down the table, and you have a company commander, and remember, he has only an 18-inch range to deploy combat patrols. But you have a reconnaissance element out there on the table, and it goes 30 inches across the table, let's say. It's just way out there. It can still deploy a combat patrol and get eliminated, and then that combat patrol will be 30 inches, maybe 33 inches from the company commander, but that's okay because it came from a reconnaissance patrol. And then you can deploy, platoons or whatever you need to deploy onto that. So that's a quick way to get platoons deep into enemy territory. Moving combat patrols. Okay, combat patrols move by issuing a move and fire action. Okay, but remember, combat patrols don't actually fire. Movement is measured from the center of the marker and is always 2d6. Ambush units may be detected when a combat patrol enters a terrain feature. So if this guy wasn't here, right, and he wasn't there, I don't see that because remember, it's an ambush and I can't visualize that. And I roll my dice and I'm able to move into this area. First of all, that violates the 8-inch rule, but I don't know because he's hidden, so I don't know I'm violating the rule. So I go into the same terrain feature, and then that'll be described in section 11 or chapter 11. Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, but right now we're in chapter 5, combat patrols. Combat patrols cannot fire, they cannot rapid move, or approach within 8 inches or 10 inches of an enemy unit or enemy combat patrols. Once at or within 8 inches or 10 inches of an enemy unit or combat patrol, no further forward movement is permitted. They may only fall back. So this is kind of neat. If I have a combat patrol here and he's got his combat patrol there, and this is 8 inches, I don't know if it is or not, but let's say it is, I can't advance this into the town. But then again, neither can he. He can't advance either because we're locked in at 8 inches. If I have a unit there and this combat patrol moves up, it has to stop within 8 inches or at 8 inches. Now, that doesn't stop this guy from moving forward, but now he's still stuck and he can only fall back. Combat patrols cannot deploy or move into impassable terrain, minefields, or wire entanglements. So wire, minefields, and impassable terrain also stop combat patrols. Last thing, removing combat patrols. A combat patrol is removed from play when it is used to deploy a unit using a deploy action. When it is in contact with an enemy unit, okay, so if an enemy unit makes it up there and is able to get into close combat, the combat patrol is automatically destroyed. And then finally, when it receives shock. Okay, so most platoons can hold up to 3 shock. Combat patrols can only hold 0 shock. So if it gets shocked, it's eliminated. Or when it is spotted by enemy reconnaissance. So if I have a reconnaissance unit and it spots the combat patrol, it's destroyed. Combat patrols are never permanently destroyed. When removed from play, they return to the reserves, and you can call them in again in a future turn. Okay, they read off this example here. It says, during a game, a British player wishes to exploit his left flank, which appears to be thinly held by the Germans. He issues a deploy action to deploy a combat patrol into a woods on his flank. He checks that the proposed position is within 18 inches of a steady company commander and not within 8 inches of the enemy units or combat patrols. As it is, he may deploy a new combat patrol from his reserves in the wood. Next turn, the player decides to deploy an infantry platoon onto the combat patrol. He checks that no enemy forces are within 8 inches. There are none, so the British platoon may now deploy and the combat patrol is removed. All right, so that was deploying the battalion and combat patrols. I hope that helped you clear up some of the rules. And stay tuned because we are continuing with this boot camp. We're going to go into the game turn next and command and control. We might even get a chance to do action. But we'll definitely do the game turn and command and control in the next video. So be sure to come back and check it out. Stay tuned. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification icon so that you'll be notified whenever I upload any of these bootcamp videos. And we'll be going over the entire rulebook in detail so that you can learn the rules and that I can also help me absorb the rules as well. All right, I'll catch you in the next one.